there I am. Hi, it's a Wednesday night, and this is a beginning ham radio class, and I'm your instructor, Gary. Ham radio call sign, Whiskey 4, Echo, Echo, Yankee. We're happy to have you with us. If you've just tuned into us on YouTube and go, what the heck is this? We have a whole series of classes. We're on Chapter 5 in this book. This is the book that's the basis for the class. You don't have to have the book, but it helps. This is the ARRL License Manual for the Technician class, the 5th edition, and we go chapter by chapter each week in order for you to get your first amateur radio license in the United States, and you get that by passing a 35-question multiple choice test. And we go over all the test questions that will be on the test and all of the answers, possible answers. And what we want to do is make sure that you know what's the right answer and why it's the right answer. So stick around. Tonight we're in Chapter 5. But first, I wanted to, today is October 1st, which as a former federal employee, this is very significant to me because this is the federal fiscal year starts on October 1st. It's a new budget year, and we're recording this on the 1st, and of course, the government shut down. And you wouldn't think, well, okay, what does that mean? The FCC is a part of the federal government. And so if you go to the laptop, Marion, this is a bulletin that I received by email today from the American Radio Relay League, and it's about the shutdown and about impacting amateur radio licensing at the FCC. And they actually stopped processing at about 1 o'clock this afternoon. So that doesn't mean I don't want you to study for your test, and I want you to take your test. The advice from the ARRL is that volunteer exam coordinators will continue to give tests and will continue to receive test results, and they will queue them up in order to get them to the FCC for processing the minute the FCC reopens, the minute that essential services are reestablished there. So I'm not going to get into politics or all of that, but I just wanted you to know this is going on right now. If you have a license and it's up for renewal and you forgot to renew it yet, you may be out of luck. You may have to go off the air for a period of time if your license lapses. I don't know if they're going to give you any grace in this regard, but that's the situation right now. The FCC is not processing license applications and renewals, etc. So tonight we're doing Chapter 5, Amateur Radio Equipment, and we're going to do a section or so, and then we'll take a break. And then we'll come back and complete Chapter 5. So the first section is all about modulation. And just want to, radio frequencies, RF. You'll hear hams talk about RF signals. And that means radio frequency energy of any type is RF. And if you have a transmitter and it's transmitting a signal on a particular frequency, okay, that's all well and good, but is that giving you any information, or is that, well, one way you could add information to that radio frequency signal is by turning it on and off. Turning it on and off in a known pattern, in a pattern that somebody at the far end might be able to determine, oh, that's Morse code. I know Morse code. I can decipher what is being sent. So the art of adding information to a radio frequency carrier is called modulation. And the most basic form of modulation would be turning it on and off in a known pattern, such as Morse code. Now, Morse code is also known as CW, or continuous wave. This goes back to the days of really early radio. We're 100 years at least into the radio adventure right now. But back in the early days, they didn't have vacuum tubes. They didn't have a lot of the things that we take for granted now. Their main transmitters were generating sparks and arcs. They had motor generators that would generate high voltages, and they'd couple sparks to a transmission line to go out to an antenna. that's why the radio guy on a boat was called Sparks, because that's what they were doing. That was really discontinuous wave. Spark gap transmitters, you sometimes see them at hamfests, generate a really broad spectrum of energy. They're very nasty as far as the quality of their signal. But then oscillators, generators, CW generators, things came along, and then continuous wave was born. So continuous wave, CW, is another name for Morse code. They used to be said to be the signal that would go the farthest for the amount of power used. It's actually been overcome by another new modulation mode. We'll talk about that as we go through. A CW energy transmits energy on or about one frequency, but just turning the signal on and off in the Morse code pattern actually generates a wider signal than just one frequency. And so this is what we call bandwidth. And it's you measure it from the peak of the signal on that center frequency, all right? And off to the side where it's the half power point over here and the half power point over here, and that distance in frequency is called the bandwidth. And for a Morse code signal, the bandwidth is about 150 hertz. That's fairly narrow, but it is not just super narrow. And the point I wanted to make is there are filters in radios that you can select to match the bandwidth of the modulated signal. So a CW signal can use very narrow filters successfully. Well, what about voice? I want to transmit my voice over radio. Well, amplitude modulation was the first voice transmission mode, and what it did was have an audio signal at an audio frequency. Let me turn on my laser pointer here so you can see my dot. There we go. So here's the audio frequency at a low range from 20 to 20,000 hertz, and a radio frequency carrier whose amplitude is being changed in accordance with the modulating frequency. So we're looking at this in the time domain, amplitude on the vertical scale and time on the horizontal scale. And this is what a modulated RF carrier envelope, is what we call it, looks like. And amplitude modulation, though, can be looked at, this is, I say, the time domain. You can also look at it in the frequency domain. So this is where you look at with amplitude on the vertical scale and frequency on the horizontal scale. And you'll see that for an AM signal, you have a center carrier, and then you have modulation information above that frequency, and you have modulation information below that frequency. This is called the upper sideband. This is called the lower sideband. But together, these three components make up an amplitude modulated signal in the frequency domain. Well, Gary, I'm probably not going to look at things in the frequency domain. Well, actually, you might. In fact, we're going to look tonight, because modern radios have displays that will display signals in the frequency domain. So we're going to see that later on tonight. So you can imagine that an amplitude modulated signal has a bandwidth, and its bandwidth is much wider. Remember, Morse code was about 150 hertz. Well, for AM communications signals, it's about 6,000 hertz, or 6 kilohertz. For broadcast radio, it's even wider, but for communications purposes, we say 6 kilohertz. And again, the signal is made up of the radio frequency carrier, an upper sideband, and a lower sideband. Or if you prefer, this is another way to look at it, same thing. Carrier there in the middle, lower sideband below the carrier frequency, and the upper sideband above the carrier frequency. So we're going to try something tonight. We haven't done this, so this is going to be interesting. I'm going to call it a Maestro moment. But before we go over to the Maestro, this is a controller, what you're looking at here, for a Flex radio. And I have a Flex 6600. That's this box right here. This is my workshop ham shack, which is downstairs just below us here, and it's connected to my local area network here at my office and house. And the Maestro see, there's no knobs on this radio. You have to control this radio either by a computer or by a Maestro. So let's go take a look over to the Maestro here in the studio, and let's see if we can find an AM signal on the 40-meter band. So follow me. So here we are. This is the Maestro over here. It's got a big knob where you can change the frequency that you're receiving, and it's got a display. This is a touch screen display that you can use to change various parameters. And I'm going to go and block it over here because you've got a much bigger display over here that we can see maybe just a little bit better. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tune up right there. And let me grab my headphones and turn up the audio. Can you hear that? This is an AM signal. The 40-meter band is a shared band between international broadcasters and amateur radio operators. And I'm talking and it's giving me an echo. I can't hear myself. But what we're seeing here, this is an AM signal. This is the AM carrier right there at the center. The red line here in this, what is known as a waterfall display. And an upper sideband and a lower sideband. So this is the first form of voice modulation, still being used today. In fact, I heard some hams doing 40-meter FM earlier this afternoon. But this is an international broadcaster from where I'm not sure. It's not a really strong signal, but you can see that it's got energy above the carrier frequency and energy below the carrier frequency. All right, we're going to come back to this. We're going to look at some single sideband signals next. But let's go back over to the presentation. And I'll turn that audio down for the moment. So single sideband, as we mentioned, it's a kind of an AM signal. It's derived from the amplitude modulated signal. If we come back to the laptop, Marion, please. If you look here, here's our AM signal. Remember, it's got that carrier, radio frequency carrier there that we saw at the center, upper sideband and lower sideband. Well, what if we could eliminate one of the sidebands and that high amplitude radio frequency carrier? Then if we had a radio with a 100-watt amplifier, that 100-watt amplifier could be used to just amplify the desired sideband. Hence, this is the upper sideband only, or down here is the lower sideband only, and this type of modulation, which is voice modulation, is called single sideband modulation. But SSB is a type of amplitude modulation. It's part of that family. You can see here, up above here, this is something interesting. This is something that VOA, Voice of America, where I used to work, used to transmit some programs via shortwave on double sideband suppressed carrier. Note there's no carrier here. But they did have two independent sidebands, and VOA would transmit Chinese on one and say Spanish on the other. It was a way that we could get program information to various locations at overseas, predating satellite transmission. Single sideband has been around since just after World War II. The Collins Radio Corporation was very involved in that, and there's a URL here for a YouTube video. You can see some of the military's use of single sideband for strategic air command communications. So single sideband bandwidth, you think about it, is about half that of an amplitude modulated signal, because we're only transmitting one of the sidebands. So we say that a single sideband bandwidth, the amount of radio frequency spectrum that we occupy to get that information out, that modulation, is about 3 kilohertz. All right, I said, let's do another Maestro moment. Let's go on back and see if we can find a single sideband signal on 40 meters. And I'm coming. I just got to grab my headset here. So if we look here on the display, I'm going to go ahead and push the touch screen over here. And so here you can see the various selections that are available to you on the Flex. Note that I've selected AM before. That's where we saw the lower sideband, the upper sideband. Now we're going to go to lower sideband for 40 meters. So I'll tell you why here in a sec. All right. And we see some signals down below. Let's go down over here. There's a very nice strong signal on 40 meters. Turning up the audio. You might want to make sure the audio is turned down there. Oh, you may have to go over to the Maestro selection.
On my meter,
There we go.
and the audio is good. There is a little static out there, but
So this is an amateur radio signal on 40 meters.
Yeah, this
lower
FTDX,
sideband.
I bought it about a month ago, and it's still new to me. I'm still
Note
trying
there's
to
no
get,
signal above
get
the
tweaked out.
yellow
I really
line,
haven't messed too much with
and there's
the,
no
with the
carrier
equalization
on
at
the
all.
yellow line. So
What
this
do
is
you
single
think they're like
sideband.
on yours? Yeah, I'm sorry. Come back, John. We had some interference there. We had something about a button.
All right. So there's our demonstration of a single sideband signal.
We weren't hearing your voice while we had the Maestro.
Okay, I don't know. Well, maybe I had it too loud.
Okay.
I was QRMing myself. Q codes, we'll talk about those. I was interfering with myself. All right, so I mentioned that we're on 40 meters and we were going to go to lower sideband. Well, why do we do that? It's partly technical back in the day when they were designing early super heterodyne radios, and it's now tradition. So if we come back to the laptop, by convention and early design principles, below 9 megahertz, we use lower sideband. And since the 40 meter band is 7 megahertz, okay, so by convention, we're going to use lower sideband. Above 9 megahertz, we use upper sideband. There are some exceptions to this. We'll talk about that. And it's on the color chart that we've talked about earlier as well. The exceptions are noted. Now, speaking of the color chart, the color chart, which is this, the American Radio Relay League's allocation frequencies from the FCC, the frequencies that we can use as hams, there are edges to each of the bands. We can't legally transmit above certain frequency. We have privileges to be able to transmit in certain modes on certain frequencies, and so we're required to make sure that we stay with that. And so the point I want to make is that we need to know if we have a radio frequency signal that's 3 kilohertz wide, and the dial indication on our radio is where the carrier would be if there was a carrier, then we have to make sure that we don't, as we're getting to the top of the band, that we stay well away from the edge of the band. Okay, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Let's go back over to the Maestro one last time, and let's check out 20 meters. So again, I'm going to go here and select the 20 meter band. I'm not even going to try for audio necessarily. And so if we go to the color chart, we're going to dial all the way up to the top of the band. And I know because from the color chart that the very top of the 20 meter band is 14,350. So this signal over here, that's not an amateur radio signal. I don't know what the heck that is. It's very interesting. But note here, 14,348. All right, notice the width. I'm not sure he's right at the edge. That would be about 14,350 right there. So yeah, he's within the band, but we can't transmit above that. Now, note, this is the yellow line. This is the indicated display on the radio. So we're at 14,347. So he's right at the edge. Anything above there would be out of band for amateur radio operators. Modern radios, if you buy a new one from ICOM or Yaesu or Flex or Elecraft, will probably prevent you from transmitting out of band. Older radios, tube-type radios and whatnot, didn't have that limitation, and so they require you to be thinking about, oh, I have a signal. It's got a bandwidth, about 3 kilohertz bandwidth. That means I need to keep my indicated display 3,000 cycles below the top edge of the band, because this is an upper sideband signal. We're above 9 megahertz, so we use upper sideband by convention. 14 megahertz, that's above 9, so that's why we're looking at an upper sideband signal. All right, come on back. So the little radios that, as technicians, you'll probably get involved with first, like the TID Radio H3 that I recommend. These are what we call FM radios. So we talked about amplitude modulation. Well, this is frequency modulation, FM. And the graphic that we have here shows you the difference. So up above on the top here on the laptop, please, thank you. Here's our audio signal, the modulating signal, the voice signal. With an AM modulation, you see it changes the amplitude of the radio frequency carrier. Whereas with an FM, the amplitude stays maximum all the time. It's a 5-watt radio is always putting out 5 watts if it's FM. And what is varying instead is the frequency. The frequency is varying in step with the modulation up here on top. So this is the difference between AM and FM. Here's a little larger diagram there for you to be able to see it. So here's the modulating audio up on top. Amplitude modulation there in the middle. You can see the amplitude of the signal is changing. Whereas with FM, the signal stays constant all the time. It's the frequency that changed. So that's frequency modulation. And for communications use, we say that the bandwidth for an FM signal is typically between 10 to 15 kilohertz wide. So remember, we started with Morse code, CW, about 150 hertz wide, and pretty narrow. Then we talked about AM signals. They're about 6 kilohertz wide. Then we talked about single sideband, which is half of that, about 3 kilohertz wide. And then FM, it's between 10 and 15 kilohertz because of the nature of the modulation. Another thing to know about FM signals with FM radios they have a circuit in the receiver side of the radio called a demodulator that takes the voice information out of the radio frequency carrier. And FM demodulators are known to capture the strongest signal and reject everything else. Which is why if you've got 2 radios and one's more powerful than the other, that's the radio that's going to get through on FM because of the capture effect of the receiver. This is different than with amplitude modulation. Amplitude modulation or SSB detectors can hear multiple signals at the same time. All right, I want to go back into time. I've been involved with computers for a while, with bulletin board systems and audio modems. Remember, you put your telephone handset in a cradle and you might get 300 bits per second. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Well, back in that same day, packet radio was being introduced to amateur radio. And packet radio is akin to that in that you had a computer or dumb terminal even that would talk to a box called a terminal node controller. And the terminal node controller sends signals to and from your radio, a handheld radio like the small HTs, and out to an antenna. And this packet radio station would allow you to connect up to your friend's packet radio station across town, and there you could send messages back and forth, or if he was hosting a bulletin board system on his system, you could maybe get some news or weather information or whatever. So this was packet radio. This is the packet of information. It's kind of like an envelope that you put the letter in. The letter is the information, but the packet is what contains it. And packet radio uses frequency modulation or phase modulation. Now, phase modulation is not so popular or not so common as FM, but phase modulation is a type of frequency modulation. Here, both the amplitude and the frequency of the modulating signal can affect the amount of frequency deviation that the signal has. Where straight FM, it's just the amplitude of the voice that changes the frequency. With phase modulation, it's amplitude and the modulating frequency. Just be aware of that. Phase modulation and FM, very much alike, and radios that can receive FM can also receive phase modulation as well. Not to be confused with another kind of modulation. Remember, modulation is adding information to a radio frequency carrier. Phase shift keying. It's a digital modulation process conveying information by changing the relative phase of a carrier signal. So it's subtly changing it, but it's transmitting ones and zeros because of those changes, and those ones and zeros can be interpreted on the far end as data. All right, moving along, another modulation scheme is frequency shift keying. This last weekend was the big CQ Worldwide Radio Teletype Contest. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of radio teletype amateur radio stations on the air trying to work as many stations as they could in a 48-hour period. And you would see signals like this with a mark tone and a space tone, and the sound of a radio teletype signal is kind of a deedle, 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 deedle. And this is a tuning indicator for radio teletype. So frequency shift keying, moving your signal from this frequency to this frequency and back and forth in rapid succession, that's radio teletype. So in review, Morse code, CW goes the farthest for the power used. That was always the convention. FT8 is actually better, and we'll talk about that in a sec. Single sideband, no, blue text. Single sideband is the voice mode that goes the farthest. There is something called digital voice. There are various flavors. It's a newer voice mode available on HF and VHF. FM has the clearest voice quality, and FM, PSK, FSK, and digital modes, all of those can transmit text files. And then packet radio uses FM, the little radios, like we have the TID radio H3 on various UHF and VHF frequencies. This little guy can be used for packet radio. All right, we're still in modulation. Still got one of these lying around in your basement? One of the old analog TV sets. You know, they mandated that we do away with them. I think there might be one or two translators still out there operating on the old standard. Amateur radio operators still use the old NTSC or fast scanned TV standard, the same thing that the commercial broadcasters used to use. And we can use it on frequencies UHF and above is typical. It was originally developed by the National Television Systems Committee, who would then also develop the color standards. And we can use it ourselves to send fast scan real-time TV. It uses amplitude modulation, believe it or not, but with part of the lower sideband suppressed. You'll see a picture here in a second. So therefore we call it, there's a vestige of the lower sideband left, so we call it vestigial sideband transmission. Now note the bandwidth here. This is really wide, 6 megahertz wide. It takes a lot of bandwidth to transmit analog fast scan TV. And here's a look at the television signal in the frequency domain. Here's the carrier right here. Here's the upper sideband, which is carrying the black and white or luminance signal, the color signal, possibly an audio carrier up here, 4.5 megahertz above, and then a vestige of the lower sideband. Not all of it there. This is fast scan analog TV, which hams can use on UHF and above. Oh, we made it. Let's go ahead and answer some questions together. You can go ahead and unmute and tell me what you think the right answer is. And remember our 3-second rule. That's 5 seconds. 3 seconds, and then give us an answer. Here's the first question. So which of the following is a form of amplitude modulation?
Charlie.
Charlie is correct. Single sideband. It's in that family. And what type of modulation is commonly used for VHF packet radio transmissions?
Alpha.
Alpha.
FM or phase modulation, PM. And which type of voice mode is often used for long-distance weak signal contacts on VHF and UHF? Which voice mode goes to the farthest?
Charlie.
Charlie.
Yeah, single sideband. And which type of modulation is commonly used for VHF and UHF voice repeaters?
Delta.
Alpha.
Yeah, it's delta. That would be FM frequency modulation. And which of the following types of signals has the narrowest bandwidth?
Charlie.
Yep, 150 hertz for CW, Morse code. And which sideband is normally used for 10-meter HF, VHF, and UHF single sideband communication? So all of those bands, which sideband do they use?
Alpha.
Alpha.
They're all above 9 megahertz, so they're all going to be using upper sideband by convention. And what is a characteristic of single sideband compared to FM?
Charlie.
Delta.
Charlie is correct. Single sideband signals have narrower bandwidth, 3 kilohertz versus 10 to 15 kilohertz. Single sideband signals are part of AM, and so they respond to interference. So lightning crashes, things like that, you'll hear it with single sideband. Single sideband signals, we didn't tune them, but we'll do it in a future class. They're actually very tricky to tune. So the answer here is the narrower bandwidth. So what is the approximate bandwidth of a typical single sideband voice signal?
Bravo.
Indeed, 3 kilohertz. You're doing great. What is the approximate bandwidth of a VHF repeater FM voice signal? FM, not Charlie, yes, between 10 and 15 kilohertz. 1 and 5, you got that right, but yeah, okay. So what is the approximate bandwidth of AM fast scan TV transmissions? Really wide.
Bravo.
Yeah, about 6 megahertz. And what is the approximate bandwidth required to transmit a CW signal?
Bravo.
Yep, 150 hertz. And which of the following is a disadvantage of FM compared with single sideband?
Bravo.
Because of the demodulator in the FM receiver, it can only lock into the strongest signal. So only one signal can be received at a time. And what is CW?
Delta.
It's another name for Morse code transmission. Great job. All right, let's move on. Transmitters and receivers. Did you have a question? Okay, guess not. So, I don't know, CB isn't so popular anymore. It used to be back in my day. And you know, you had a 24 channel, I think it was, and then they went to 48 channels. But they had a knob on the radios that would change the channel and go click, 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 click. We don't have that. we have what I call the big knob. You saw it over there on the Maestro. It controls the variable frequency oscillator. It controls the frequency that we operate, and it's continuous tuning as opposed to channelized. All of our bands are continuous with the exception of one. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So, so here's a typical amateur radio transceiver, and with lots of knobs and buttons, which I don't know how you feel about it, but turns me on. I like that sort of thing. One of the knobs that are common is the squelch control. Commonly used with CB radios and amateur radio handy talkies. And what the squelch control does, this is what they also call carrier operated squelch, is in the absence of a radio frequency signal, it mutes the audio output on the radio. So the radio isn't, blaring all the time. But you can adjust the squelch and you can turn it off if you need to, if you want to receive a very weak signal. So on an HT, there's usually a button as well where you can modify the squelch. On some HF transceivers, they also have squelch controls. Again, it's carrier-operated squelch. In the absence of a carrier, the radio goes silent, but when a carrier comes on the frequency, then it'll open up and you'll be able to hear that. Handy talkies, mobile radios, things in your car, also make the most use of squelch, because you don't want to be hearing static as you're driving down the road all the time. So it keeps the radio silent until a signal comes on the air. Now, those were carrier-operated squelch that I was describing. There's other types of selective squelch as well, called CTCSS. Motorola called it private line, also known as tone squelch. So continuous tone coded squelch system, or PL, they're the same thing, and it just transmits a very low frequency subaudible tone along with your voice, and some repeater systems require that in order for the repeater to be activated. There's also another type of digital squelch called digital coded squelch that is very, very similar. Well, how do you know if you need that sort of a thing? Well, if you're a member of a local ham club, they'll clue you in. They'll tell you what you need to know to get into the repeater. Or you can buy a repeater directory. There are books you can find at HamFests. The ARRL does that. And there are also apps for your phone. A repeater book is a free app for Android and Apple phones that can give you the information about repeaters local to your area. Now, I mentioned squelch controls, keeping the radio silent, but if you're trying to receive a really weak signal, you may have to turn the squelch off and to listen for that weak FM signal, because if you have the squelch on, you'll never hear it if it's a very weak signal. So input devices for your radio. Remember, we said that modulation is the process of adding information to a radio frequency carrier. And there are all sorts of different input devices that can modulate the radio carrier. The Morse code key in the upper left there, a bug, which is a kind of a Morse code key there on the right, microphones, even keyboards. You can use keyboards that are dedicated for Morse code transmission. Now, if you're going to use, this is called an iambic paddle. This is going to be plugged into an electronic keyer, which is a box that takes the electrical signals from this device and converts it into very properly spaced Morse code, dots and dashes. It handles all of the spacing and makes things sound great. Nowadays, this electronic keyer box is built in to most radios. But if you are into the vintage radios, the older ones, you may have to add a keyer like this, an electronic keyer, to do Morse code with an iambic paddle. And we won't go into detail about this, but one paddle sends dots, the other paddle sends dashes, and if you squeeze them together, it alternates between the two. People can send Morse code at really unbelievable speeds using equipment like this. So when you get your radio, and I'm a voice guy, you can tell I like to talk. Well, okay, there are going to be connectors to hook up your microphone. The 8-pin Foster connector, which you see there, is a very common connector for radios. Kenwood used it, ICOM used it, I think Yaesu used it at one point in time. The problem is there's no standard. They're not the same. So a Kenwood mic will not necessarily work with an ICOM radio or vice versa. Hence, you'll get all sorts of adapters or things that will allow headsets or other things to interface with your radio. So just be aware that these adapters, Heil Radio sells a bunch of them, are required sometimes in order to get a microphone signal into your radio. And while we're talking about voice modulation, it's, Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Too little, that's not enough modulation. Too much, you're too loud and distorted. You want to be just right. You want to have a very clean RF signal on the output of your radio. So use the instructions for your radio. It'll describe the process to go through to set up your radio for proper transmission. Have somebody listen on the air and they can clue you in when you're sounding good. All right. Buttons and knobs, gotta love them. This is an Elecraft transceiver. So we talked about some of these already. The VFO, or the variable frequency oscillator, that's the big knob, and that sets the operating frequency that you're going to use. Most high frequency radios and many VHF, UHF radios are multi-mode. They're radios that can send and receive AM, single sideband, CW, FM, radio teletype, and various data modes, so multi-mode. They may have memory channels available, memory slots that can hold preset frequency and mode settings. So if you've got a activity that you do on a regular basis, you can put that in the radio in a memory channel and just recall it immediately. Radios may be multi-band. They can operate on more than one frequency band. HF radios typically are from 160 meters all the way up to 6 meters. Some even go farther than that. And then tuning with that big knob is adjusting the receiver transmit frequency. And so you can use the big knob, or some radios have direct keypad entry where they've got numbers on the front panel and you just push the button and hit enter and boom, you're right on frequency. So those are some terms for transceivers. Receiver terms that we need to know about is sensitivity. That's the ability of a radio to be able to detect a very weak signal. How sensitive is it? And selectivity, it's the ability to separate the desired signal from all of the rest. And that's a radio's selectivity. And some other controls that you'll see are audio frequency control, volume control. Older radios might have an IF gain control, IF filter selection that selects the appropriate bandwidth depending on the mode. So narrower for CW, wider for AM. Radio frequency gain control to change the gain of the input section. Notch filters, attenuators, other types of controls. When you're selecting a filter, we want to match the mode, the bandwidth of the mode, because when you do that, you get the best reception, you get the best signal to noise ratio. So another control on your radio receiver that's very important is the AGC control. I say use it or lose it. And when I say lose it, I'm talking about your hearing, especially if you wear headphones. And old timers used to say, oh no, I run my radio with the AGC off, and I turn the gain up and the volume, and my radio works great. And you go, well, why did you do that? And they say, huh? What'd you say? I can't hear you. Speak up, young man. No. Don't lose your hearing. So AGC keeps your receive volume under control. So that should a strong signal suddenly come up on the frequency that you're listening to a weak signal on, it doesn't blast you out of the chair. And you can select its action, fast, medium, or slow, and other characteristics depending on the radio. But use AGC. Another way that you can fine tune on reception is something called receiver incremental tuning. So it allows you to, without changing the big knob, that's on the desired frequency, but if somebody in a net, let's say, there's more than one station, and somebody's kind of drifting off frequency, you can follow them with your fine tuning or receiver incremental tuning so that they sound normal. Single sideband voice can be made to sound normal with the fine tuning control. Receivers and transceivers will typically have an S meter. It's a signal strength meter, and it's used to indicate received signal strength. So it's marked off, I don't know why they did it this way, but they did it this way, in S units on the left side of the meter, and then in decibels on the right side of the meter. And the needle will come up here and say, here you would say that, okay, you're reading S5 on my meter. It's all great, all well and good. The next increment is S6. To get from S5 to S6, the signal power from the other end has to increase by 4 times, 6 dB. Each one of these S units is worth about 6 decibels, or 4 times. Although on some radios, that might not be strictly calibrated that way, and some radios are more generous. So read your manual and find out. Other adjustments that you can have on your receiver is something called a noise blanker. If you've ever tried to put a radio in your car, especially the older cars where they had non-resistive spark plugs, they generate a lot of popping and electrical static and whatnot. Well, a noise blanker can help eliminate those kinds of pulses. Noise blankers can also be effective on electric fences. So if you're out in the country and your neighbor has an electric fence that's going pop, 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 well, noise blankers may be able to help with some of that. So come back to me just for a second. My first radio receiver, my ham radio receiver, I don't have a picture of it, but it was a Heathkit Mohawk. Oh, it was a big sucker, and it weighed like about 100 pounds. And it used all vacuum tubes, but it looked so good on my bench there. And when I had my novice license, that's what I used to listen to Morse code signals coming from all over the country. But the problem with that radio was that as I'd go up in band, 80 and 40 meters, they were fine. But I'd try to go up to 15 meters or 10 meters, well, it couldn't hear signals very well. Its sensitivity was somewhat poor. And so what I had to do, and I went out and bought one of these actually, it's an RF preamplifier. And you'll find these at Hamfest. Come on back to the laptop, Marion. An RF preamplifier. This is used for radios like my old Mohawk that were not very sensitive on the higher frequency bands, and it installs between the antenna and the receiver, and you tune it, you set it to the various bands that you want here, and you can tune it to peak the signal, and it restores sensitivity on the high frequency bands. Modern radios today don't require these, but you'll still see these at Hamfest, and there's a test question. Where do you put an RF preamplifier? Well, the RF preamplifier is used for a receiver, and it installs between the antenna and the receiver. More transmitter terms. We talked about the mic gain control. You want it to be just right. You can have compression for your voice. You can also have equalization. So those are what we call speech processor settings. And then an RF power level control on the output. So if you've got a 100-watt radio, but you're driving an amplifier, let's say, the amplifier may only want to see 30 watts maximum. So you have that RF output control that you can turn down from 100 watts down to 30 watts and make your RF power amplifier, like this one, happy. RF power amplifiers, also known as linear amplifiers, are used to increase transmitter power. This is an Elecraft KPA 500, and it's an amplifier that takes about 30-40 watts in to give you 500 watts out. And remember, the legal limit for amateur radio operators for general and above on all frequencies is 1,500 watts, with the exception of certain bands. So this is actually a small linear amplifier. There are 1,500 watt linear amplifiers as well. For VHF and UHF, the form that the amplifiers take are usually looking like this. We call them power bricks. And you take a signal going in and it's amplified out. Let's say 5 watts in will give you 100 watts out. And also there's a mode switch on these. Right here is one of them. It changes the way the amplifier is set up. For FM, you don't care about amplitude variations, so it can set the transistors to a more efficient operation, whereas with single sideband, which is in the bottom position, that's an amplitude modulated signal, so you want to make sure that the amplifier is biased such that it can amplify the positive peaks and the negative peaks equally. So that's a mode switch on the power bricks. They typically, well, I just said that, okay, and linear amplification, that's what we call for single sideband, and non-linear amplification, that's what they called for Morse code or FM. They can use non-linear amplification, which is a little more power efficient for the amplifiers. And when we're talking about power, what are we talking about? Well, for modulated signals, amplitude modulated like single sideband, we talk about peak envelope power. And we talk about calculating based on the peak of the envelope, that amplitude right there. Whereas when we're talking about Morse code or radio teletype or FM, we're talking about continuous power. The amplitude stays constant. And here's a block diagram of a chain where we have a transceiver over here on the left going into a linear amplifier that could be bypassed, I guess, a low-pass filter to prevent television interference, a standing wave ratio bridge to tell us how well we're matched, and then going out to an antenna tuner where we can adjust some of the impedance matching and out to the antenna. So the issue comes sometimes with the linear amplifier here. What happens, I said that they typically want 30 watts in. What happens if you send more? Well, you don't get more out. What you get is clipping. You overdrive the amplifier. Instead of amplifying cleanly what the input signal is here, you get clipped peak here and a clipped peak here. Here a peak, there a peak. No, that's a different thing. And you get lots of spurious output, harmonic trash. This is not good. You don't want to overdrive a linear amplifier. And you want an amplifier that has a really good signal, desired signal out and no harmonic output. This is bad. This is the spurious emissions. And when you're doing these testings, normally we don't want you to be transmitting into an antenna, so you can use something called a dummy load. They are test antennas that don't radiate signals. This is a classic, the old Heath Cantenna, which is a 50 ohm non-inductive resistor that sits in a paint can that's filled with mineral oil. And the mineral oil heats up with the radio frequency energy from your transmitter. You can get these guys pretty darn hot. So that's one form. You can build your own using non-inductive resistors to do a 50 ohm load, or you can buy smaller ones like this for HTs and mobile units. All right, can you imagine? We talked about computers earlier with bulletin board systems, but computers are used all over the place anymore, especially in ham radio. There are many ways you can use them for logging, sending and receiving Morse code, the digital signals. Now with software-defined radios like the Flex or even others, you have the radio display and control. Your antenna analyzer, you can connect it up to a laptop and get a graph of the antenna performance. You can operate stations remotely. You can operate your station over the internet. And computer sound cards can be used also for the digital modes, PSK 31, 32, 31, and others. So for older radios that don't have a built-in audio interface, you can buy radio interfaces, like the Signal Link there on the left or the West Mountain Radio there on the right. And you're needing to interface 3 signals: audio from the radio to the computer, audio from the computer to the radio, and then a signal to push to talk that tells the transmitter, the transceiver, to go into transmit. Usually that's a wire connection that goes to a pin in the radio, and when you ground that, then the radio will go into transmit. So these are the three things that we need: audio from the radio to the computer, audio from the computer to the radio, and that push-to-talk activation. So these interfaces provide all of those three. They're actually sound cards built in here, and so you're all set. Now you can use a classic sound card in your computer, the audio from the radio to the computer and the audio from the computer to the radio. It's the push-to-talk activation that gets a little hairy, and you have to use serial interfaces and whatnot. So sometimes these radio interfaces are better to use. Modern radios like the ICOM 7300, which is a really good entry-level HF radio, has a USB jack on the back that has a sound card built into the radio. So all of those three functions are carried over a USB cable to your computer. So you can do all of the digital modes and computer logging, etc., and just with a single USB connection. So this radio is from 160 meters through 6 meters. That's the typical. But I want to operate on 2 meters. Do I have to buy a whole new radio? Well, you could, or you could buy something like this. It's called a transverter. And a transverter converts both transmit and receive to a different band. So you could get a transverter, this is one from Elecraft, for 2 meters, let's say, for example, and it'll convert the 2 meter band to the 10 meter band and on your radio, and it allows you to then use that great radio on 2 meters for multi-mode operation, for example. All right, questions? Here we go. So why should you not set your transmit frequency to be exactly at the edge of an amateur band or subband? Read carefully.
Delta.
Delta is correct, to allow for calibration area in the transmitter frequency display so that the modulation sidebands do not extend beyond the band edge, we saw that, and to allow for transmitter frequency drift, especially if you have an older tube-type transmitter. So all of those choices. What would cause your FM transmission audio to be distorted on voice peaks?
Charlie.
Charlie.
Yeah, no, it's Charlie.
Charlie.
If you talk too loud into it, it'll distort. So yeah, and you can minimize that just by holding the radio further away from your mouth. What is the purpose of a squelch function?
Delta.
Bravo.
It is Bravo. The squelch function mutes the receiver audio when there's no signal present. You were thinking of the noise blanker. And what is an electronic keyer?
Charlie.
Charlie.
It's a device that assists in the manual or hand sending of Morse code using an iambic paddle, for example. And what is the effect of excessive microphone gain on single sideband transmissions?
Bravo.
Yep. If too much mic gain, you're going to get distorted audio on transmit. And which of the following can be used to enter a transceiver's operating frequency?
Alpha.
Alpha.
If the radio has a keypad, you can use the keypad or the big knob, the VFO knob. And how is squelch adjusted so that a weak FM signal could be heard?
Alpha.
It's a big, long way of saying turn the squelch off. Set the squelch threshold so that the receiver output audio is on all the time. You're turning the squelch off. All right, what is the way to enable quick access to a favorite frequency or channel on your transceiver?
Bravo.
Yep, store it in a memory channel. And which of the following controls could be used if the voice pitch of a single sideband signal returning to your CQ call seems too high-pitched or too low-pitched? What could you use?
Delta?
Yes, the receive incremental tuning, also known as a clarifier on some radios. And what is the advantage of having multiple receive bandwidth choices on a multi-mode transceiver?
Delta?
Not delta.
Oh, got that wrong.
You want to match the receive bandwidth with the transmit bandwidth.
So it'd be Bravo.
Yeah, it permits noise or interference reduction. You don't want to be receiving a wider bandwidth than you need because that's all noise. So it permits some noise or interference reduction by selecting a bandwidth matching the mode. And which of the following receiver filter bandwidths provides the best signal-to-noise ratio for single sideband reception? What's the best choice?
Charlie.
Yeah, 2400 hertz, which is a common filter bandwidth. We say that single sideband is 3000 cycles wide, but it doesn't have to be. It could be narrower. All right, what is the result of tuning an FM receiver above or below a signal's frequency? And what do you think?
Delta?
Yeah, have you ever, you're listening to your favorite FM station and you bump the knob and it goes a little off and the music doesn't sound really good? Well, that's what happens. You're slightly off frequency, so you get a distortion in the signal's audio. And which term describes the ability of a receiver to detect the presence of a signal?
Bravo.
Bravo.
Yeah, sensitivity. How sensitive is the radio? And which term describes the ability of a receiver to discriminate between multiple signals?
Charlie.
Yep, that's selectivity. And what device converts the RF input and output of a transceiver to another band?
Charlie.
That's that transverter, the one we saw from Elecraft. And what is the function of a transceiver's PTT input?
Bravo?
It is Bravo. Switches the transceiver from receive to transmit when it's connected to ground. And what is the function of the SSB CWFM switch on a VHF power brick?
Bravo.
Sets the amplifier for the proper operation in the selected mode. Yeah, single sideband requires one setting and FM requires another. And what device increases the transmitted output power from a transceiver?
Bravo?
Yes, a radio frequency power amplifier, also known as a linear amplifier. And where is an RF preamplifier installed?
Alpha.
Alpha.
That's from my old Heath Mohawk, between the antenna and the receiver. And what can you do if you are told your FM handheld or mobile transceiver is over-deviating?
Delta.
No, it's delta. You're too loud, so you can talk farther away from the microphone to get your amount. The frequency is deviating down to a smaller amount. So you talk farther away from the mic. Because remember, with FM, the amount of deviation, frequency change is dependent on the amplitude of your signal, your voice signal. All right. What is the primary purpose of a dummy load?
Alpha.
Alpha.
Yeah, to prevent transmitting signals on the air when making tests. And what does a dummy load consist of?
Bravo. Bravo.
Yeah, we want a non-inductive or non-reactive resistor mounted on a heat sink or in a mineral oil bath or something to take the heat away. Very good. Ladies and gentlemen, you made it to the intermission. You have a well-deserved 5-minute break, so get up and move around, do what you can, and we'll come back in 5 minutes. Thanks. Just didn't. Yep.
Yeah, multiple hits there.
Turn my mic. Yeah. great to see you. Hope you got a chance to move around a little bit and get some energy out and the kinks and everything else. Just short sections here and we're almost done. We're going to talk, continuing in the modulation area, digital communications. We briefly mentioned radio teletype and Morse code earlier. They got their start, those electromechanical devices. Here's an old radio teletype terminal. Radio teletype got started on land. They used circuits, and wire circuits, and then later got adopted to a radio teletype. Then we evolved to dedicated computerized systems that you could send and receive Morse code or radio teletype. They had one function. Then software came out where you could actually put it on your general purpose computer and do Morse code and radio teletype using just software. We mentioned also packet radio, what we think is probably the first amateur radio true digital mode, dating back from the 1970s, where we had the terminal and the terminal node controller and your radio. It uses something called the X25 protocol, although since amateurs were using it, amateurs were given the designation AX.25, and the protocol to encapsulate all the data had a header and a checksum for error correction, the data, and then one thing about packet radio, if that packet of information got garbled in transmission somehow, interference or whatever else, the responding radio on the other side would say, "I didn't get it, send it again." That's an automatic request for resending, or ARQ. Packet radio has evolved. Nowadays you don't hear so much about direct packet radio communication, but you do hear about APRS, the automatic packet reporting system, which is used to actually, in some radios they have it built in, and it can tell people who are monitoring what your location is. It uses a GPS receiver to determine latitude and longitude and inputs that automatically into packets that are sent out automatically by your radio. So you can go to a website, you can do this right now, aprs.fi. And if you go there and move the map around to your location, you'll see the location of amateur radio operators using APRS in your general vicinity. And you can do the same thing as well. So it's another way that packet radio and digital communications has evolved in amateur radio. Another way that it's evolved is WinLink, or the ability to send emails via amateur radio. And it uses stations that are called gateway stations that are dedicated to be receiving on certain frequencies. They can receive email signals on HF or VHF, UHF, and then connect those out to the public internet and vice versa. So WinLink is a way to send and receive emails on amateur radio. There are some other new systems that are more advanced than this, but they're not part of the test, so we're not going to go into those yet. Other digital modes, data modes are limited to 300 baud symbol rate, the very low data rate below the 10-meter band. Radio teletype is interesting because it uses an old 5-bit code called the Baudot code. There's PACTOR, or packet radio systems that are used on HF, and PSK31. I don't know why I still have 32 in some of my settings, but okay. These are other digital modes that are being used on high frequencies. But right now, the 800-pound gorilla in the room, the granddaddy of digital data communications on ham radio, is FT8. Named after Joe Frank and Joe Taylor and Steve Frank. FT8, that's Joe Taylor in the upper right-hand corner, Princeton University Nobel laureate, who in his spare time was a ham radio operator and developed the software. It's gone through a bunch of evolutions, but the WSJTX software started out years ago as software that you could send signals up to the moon and get signals bounced back down to you. Hams have been doing this for years, but it required a huge investment in really big antennas. The 2-meter band is the primary band for Earth, Moon, Earth. 6-9-meter antennas, just huge, because there's not much energy that comes back from the moon, and then the same kind of thing required for reception of signals. Well, Mr. Taylor and Mr. Frank decided determined that they could trade time for signal strength. They could use the computer's processing power to take weak signals in, analyze them, determine the data, and then JT65, this mode was developed to allow your typical ham with Yagi antennas on 2 meters to point those Yagi antennas at the moon, send signals up to the moon, and get them to bounce back down and be processed by this software. So that's how it got started. There are other modes as well in the WSJTX software, one called Whisper, which is for propagation checking weak signals. FT8, that's the granddaddy right now, that's the big one. There's also Meteor Scatter and other modes in the software. So FT8 is Steve Frank and Joe Taylor. They're the co-developers. There was also a British ham as well, and I don't have his name, I'm sorry. 8 is for the 8 frequency shift keying format. There are actually 8 frequencies involved. An FT8 signal occupies just 50 hertz of bandwidth. So remember, Morse code was 150 hertz. So as a weak signal mode, this is the best one. It can hear barely audible or even inaudible signals. It can decode them. And it's great for low power DX. So back when the 11-year sunspot cycle was at its nadir, when it was at its worst, FT8 was a saving grace for amateur radio, because previously thought to be dead bands could be activated using FT8. It made it through. But the old timers were up in arms. Oh my God. FT8 is a contact, it's not a conversation. And then you got computers talking to computers. How is FT8 working out for you? Well, my computer is working Asia right now. It's not supposed to be automated, but some hams figured out how to automate it. All right, so know about FT8. Digital terms, bit error rate has to do with how the quality of the signal that's being received at the other end. We talked about parity and checksums. Parity bits are extra data that's added for error checking, so that the word that gets to the other end is always odd or even, for example. Digipeater is a digital radio repeater used to relay digital communications using a mode called store and forward. You can send it a message to be held for, let's say, Dave, KE4EA. And when Dave, KE4EA, logs in, the message will go to him. Node stations are stations that route data communications across a network. And then phase shift keying. PSK31 was the most popular HF digital communications mode before FT8, and then FT8 wiped it off the map practically. It's still out there, but not so many. All right. A radio message server is part of the WinLink system. Global positioning system, GPS, we talked about that. If you're going to get data in and out of old computers, you're going to not use a USB port. Probably you're going to be using those old serial ports. Remember those, 9-pin or 15-pin? They're still around in amateur radio equipment. But the USB is pretty much taken over. Gateway stations, again, part of the WinLink system to provide a connection to the internet. And BBSs, they're still out there. Did you know you have digital systems operating in your house right now? Of course you do, because Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is also known as IEEE 802.11. That's the standard. It's 2.4 gigahertz is the first Wi-Fi band. It's also a ham radio band, known as the 13-meter band. And hams have modified old routers like this Linksys for experimental long-range connectivity experiments. And hams actually, most units in your home are maximum 1 watt output. Hams can go up to 10 watts. Now, you can't interconnect it with the public internet, but that's another thing. All right, we're not going to go any further because we have some questions. Let's see how we do. So how are the transceiver audio input and output connected in a station configured to operate using FT8?
Bravo.
WSJT, Weak Signal Joe Taylor. I forgot to mention that to you. Yeah, that's the software that you use for FT8. And what signals are used in a computer radio interface for digital mode operations? What three things do you need?
Charlie?
Charlie, receive audio, transmit audio, and transmitter keying, or push to talk. And which of the following connections is made between a computer and a transceiver to use computer software when operating digital modes?
Alpha?
No. That would be connecting audio to the PTT line. That won't work.
That was
Charlie.
It is, Charlie. You want an in and an out. So the computer's line in is one of the connections to the transceiver's speaker out. So this would be a valid connection, one of the three things that we require. And what is an amateur radio station that connects to other amateur stations to the internet? What is a station that connects other stations to the internet? What do you call it?
Alpha.
Yeah, Alpha, a gateway station. And which of the following is a digital communications mode?
Delta.
Delta.
Yeah, packet radio, yes. IEEE 802.11, that's Wi-Fi, yes. FT8, yeah, all of those. And what kind of data can be transmitted by APRS?
Delta.
Charlie.
So Charlie is possible. We know with APRS you can send GPS position data
Oh, what, Delta.
and text messages as well. I didn't mention, but yeah, you can send short text messages. So all of those can be transmitted via APRS. It's the outgrowth of packet radio. And which of the following is an application of APRS?
Alpha?
Yeah, it's used for events, races, things like that. It's showing real-time tactical digital communications in conjunction with a map showing the location of the stations, that APRS.FI. And what does the term, or the abbreviation PSK mean?
Bravo.
Phase shift keying. And which of the following is included in packet radio transmissions? Read carefully.
Delta.
It is all of those. A checksum that permits error correction, a header that contains the call sign of the station to which the information is being sent, and an automatic repeat request in case of error. That's all characteristics of packet radio. And which of the following operating activities is supported by digital mode software in the WSJTX software suite?
This is the one I got confused, but I said Delta, but I don't know.
And you are correct. It got started as Earth Moon Earth using the mode JT65. Then Whisper is weak signal propagation, and then Meteor Scatter is also a mode used in WSJTX, so all of those are correct. And when you get the software installed on your computer, you'll see it. It's free, by the way, the software. So what is an ARQ transmission system?
Charlie.
Yeah, it's an error correction method in which the receiving station detects errors, that's not right, and sends a request for retransmission. And which of the following best describes an amateur radio mesh network? That's my fault. I did not enumerate on this. When I said that hams can modify those routers, like the Linksys routers, they can set up their own networks, and it's known as mesh networks. So it's an amateur radio-based data network using commercial Wi-Fi equipment with modified firmware, making a mesh network. All right, FT8, what is it?
Bravo?
It is very weak signal, low signal to noise operation. All right. I don't know why they put them in this, but power supplies and batteries, that's part of this section. Some radios have built-in power supplies. They just plug into 120 volts AC. A lot of 200 watt radios have their own power supplies. Most ham radios, though, operate on 12 volts, and they require a 12 volt power supply that converts the 120 volt AC down to 12 volts DC. And when we say 12 volts DC, we really mean 13.8 volts. Now that's when you're driving in your car and the alternator is charging your battery. That's typically the voltage that your car will have, 13.8 volts. We still call them 12 volt supplies, but okay, it's 13.8. And power supplies can be conventional or switching types. So conventional use big power transformers. They're very heavy. If you're going to the Rock Hill Ham Fest on Saturday, go ahead and take a look at the power supplies they have there on offer. Pick them up. If it's really heavy, that's a linear power supply, which uses a power transformer. Or if it's really lightweight, like this Elenco, it's using a switching power supply with very smaller, much smaller transformers. So both of them work. Both of them work fine. Early versions of the switching supplies were a little noisy on high frequencies. They've since pretty much cured those problems. Mobile radios, 50 watt radios, for example, for VHF, UHF, you need to get one rated at least 15 amps of current capacity. For 100 watt radios, for HF, you need one rated at least 30 amps. And they're regulated to prevent power fluctuations. And Astron is a really good name for power supplies. Elenco here, this will be fine too. Come back to me just for a second. So I contend that amateur radio operators are frugal, cheapskates. So I had a need for a 12 volt power supply, not for ham radio equipment, but for a security system at my old house. And because I wanted to replace all the wall warts, because those little wall warts that you get are really RF noisy. They generate a lot of interference. And I said, I want to replace all of those with a 12 volt power supply, because they were 12 volts. And yeah, okay, I'm going to do that. But then I cheaped out. I went on Amazon. I knew better. I knew Astron was what I wanted, but I didn't want to spend the money for Astron. So I went to Amazon and got a cheap Chinese power supply. It was rated okay, 13.8 volts, like 15 amps. I thought, yeah, this will be fine. This will be great. Worked for 2 weeks. Then the regulator transistor shorted out, and instead of putting 12 volts on my cameras, they put 21 volts on the cameras. Poof, gone. So learn from my mistake. Don't buy cheap Chinese power. Well, I'm not talking against China. Just don't buy cheap power supplies. Buy good ones, rated ones. If you don't know what's good, ask at your local ham club. They'll tell you. Astron is the gold standard. Car batteries, we have all sorts of different kind of battery choices now, but car batteries are lead acid batteries. Again, 13.8 volts when the vehicle alternator is running. Charging the batteries or discharging releases hydrogen gas, explosive gases that must be vented. And charging too fast can release high levels of that hydrogen. So just keep that in mind. That's a safety issue. If you're going to put a radio in your car, FM is pretty much immune to noise. So if you're going to put an FM, VHF, UHF radio, you're probably good to go. If you're going to put a single sideband radio, well, that'll hear noise. That'll hear amplitude changes. You'll hear alternator whine, you'll hear spark plug popping, you'll hear grounding and bonding issues in your vehicle. You got to make sure you have the proper connections. It used to be you could put the 12-volt negative lead on any metal in a car. You can't do that anymore. You have to have the negative and the positive all the way back to the battery. That's the best way to do it. And you may have a current sensor in the engine compartment that senses when current is being drained from the battery. If you don't know what you're doing, just make sure to get some help. So you put the connections at the right place to make sure that you have properly charged battery in your car. You don't want your car battery to be discharged. And replaceable batteries. The old flashlight batteries, carbon zinc batteries, are not rechargeable. They're disposable. Alkaline batteries are not rechargeable. They're disposable. Nickel cadmium, that's rechargeable. Lithium ion, that's rechargeable. But here's the various types and whether they're disposable or rechargeable. Right now, lithium iron phosphate batteries are the rage. The beautiful thing about these is they're no longer as heavy as those lead acid batteries. They're pretty lightweight for the current capacity that they have. So here's one, 12.8 volts at 100 amp hours. And you can, if you know the average current of your radio, for example, let's say it's 5 amps, that's pretty high, but okay. And if you know the amp hours, then you can take 100 divided by 5, and you know you've got about 20 hours of operation with this battery. Now, most radios, 5 isn't actually not a bad estimate because on receive, radios don't use a lot of power, but on transmit they do. So the average probably would be about 5 amps. And generators or inverters are things that you can use to power your station in emergency situations. Just buy high quality. You have issues of voltage and frequency regulation on some generators. Inverters, so if you want to convert DC to AC, get the pure sine wave inverters. It's hard to find modified sine wave inverters anymore, but you want to get the good one. And how big? How big should the generator be, or how big should the battery be? Well, you want to make sure that you know about how much power the radio is going to consume on transmit. That's the biggest power use. How much idle current there is on receive, and any other inrush currents. If you're using a DC power supply, for example, all of those things you want to keep in mind. And you want to make sure that your wiring is the appropriate wire gauge. You don't want to use too thin of a wire, because you'll get voltage drop on the cable from the battery to the radio. So you might start out with 13.8 volts, but if you use a really thin wire and you're drawing a lot of current, you may only have 11 volts at the radio. That's no good. So the goal is to minimize voltage drop. Okay, here we are. Questions? I think this is the last section. So which of the following is an appropriate power supply rating for a typical 50-watt output mobile FM transceiver?
Bravo?
Not Bravo.
Bravo.
Not Bravo.
Delta.
Delta. Remember I said 15 amps. Well, they're saying 12, but 13.8 volts at 12 amps at least for a 50-watt radio. And why are short, heavy gauge wires used for a transceiver's DC power connection?
Alpha.
Yeah, you want to minimize voltage drop. If you got 13.8 volts at one end, you want 13.8 at the other. And how can you determine the length of time the equipment can be powered from a battery?
Bravo.
Yep, divide the battery's amp hour rating
Bravo.
by the average current draw of the equipment. And where should the negative power return of a mobile transceiver be connected in a vehicle?
Alpha.
Alpha, at the 12-volt battery chassis ground. Back in the day, in the 50s and 60s, you could connect it to any metal piece on the car and you'd be safe. Not anymore. All right, which of the following battery chemistries is rechargeable?
Bravo.
Bravo is correct. Yeah, Delta. All of those,
Delta.
nickel metal hydride, lithium ion, and lead acid, all can be recharged. And which of the following battery chemistries are not rechargeable?
Bravo.
The old flashlight batteries, carbon zinc. And what type of circuit controls the amount of voltage from a power supply?
Alpha.
Alpha.
You buy,
Alpha.
yeah, you buy a regulated power supply. That's the regulator. It keeps it at a constant 13.8 volts. And what hazard is caused by charging or discharging a battery too quickly?
Alpha.
Overheating or outgassing hydrogen gas. All right, very good. End of chapter 5, you made it, but I would just want to share with you 3 websites to be able to review test questions. And you'll get this presentation tomorrow when you get my email and the link to the PDF. But the ARRL's exam review, and that's a great website. Hamstudy.org has a great review, and QRZ.com. Now, with the first one here, you can review by chapter, and it corresponds to our book. So this is the one that we primarily recommend. And you can sign up for a free account there and go ahead and begin to review, because you know, we're over halfway through the class. And you're doing great. Come on back to me. Are there any questions or comments before we get out of here? Let's go ahead. If you can remove the spotlight, Dave, please. Upper left-hand corner of the. There you go. Any comments or questions? I wore them out. All right. Well, keep smiling. You're doing great. Remember when you first saw this book and you looked at this stuff and you went, I'll never get any of this crap. You're getting some of it now. It's coming. You're over halfway through. We're going to get you there. All right. We'll see you next week for Chapter 6. Until then, 73.
All right.
Okay, we got to show you how to do the slide and the fade to black.
All right. I did that. Well,
You didn't do the slide.
what's the slide? I thought Fade to Black would do that, but I guess not.
No.
Okay.
Fade to black, took it to black, but that's okay. The slide is this.